Very much. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation, and for all of you for coming today. I'm the warm-up act for Dermot Fernihough, it seems. But thank you for coming. Okay, so what we wanted to do with this question, really, myself and Alan had some conversations with Alan's PhD colleague, Enda Hargadon, about this question, about whether we could bring something to this question that hadn't been done before. And our backgrounds are as economists, as economic historians. We take quantitative approaches. We look at the numbers to see whether we can shine any light on history through understanding the numbers. So as an economist, we take quite a different approach. Even in our style, we are quite different in our presentation. So this will probably be somewhat different in terms of its format to what you've seen before. But at any point, if anyone has any questions, I know it's not customary to do that, but I'm happy to take any questions at all during the talk. Okay, so what we want to do is to look at this very old question in Irish history. Did the changes in voting rights affect the outcome of the 1918 election? Okay, so these two events happened around the same time. It seems natural that they should. They were both big changes in terms of the people who are entitled to vote, and of course the Sinn Féin victory was a landslide victory. So it's been very tempting to draw those parallels between those two events. But we want to see whether this has any, or there's any evidence of this in the actual voting data. Of course, the particular aspect of the 1918 Representation of the People Act that gets picked up in our popular media is the extension of the voting rights to women for the first time. Okay, so we want to look at this dimension also. We want to see whether perhaps women and men had different preferences. There's different groups were being enfranchised at the same time. We also want to look at the issue of turnout and whether people actually did use their vote, and what can we say about the factors that influenced this across Ireland in 1918. We're not content to leave it there. We want to look at other factors that might explain vote shares for the various parties who are contesting this election, to try and understand and get a better picture of what was driving this 1918 election victory for Sinn Féin. Okay, and we will go straight to the results to give away the ending, as is customary for economists. What we find is that the franchise changes can't explain the scale of the victory. In fact, we don't really see any gains to Sinn Féin from the extension of the franchise, and we sort of reject this hypothesis that this was a key driver of the Sinn Féin victory in 1918. When we look at women, when we look at the relationships between women voters and support for Sinn Féin, we actually find that there's a negative relationship. Where there are more women voters, seems to be a lower level of support for Sinn Féin. Okay, and we think we can tell a story about why that may have been. It's strange that this election today, and for most people, the 1918 election is remembered for, as I said, the enfranchisement of women. But when we talk about the Sinn Féin election, we tend to think about the enfranchisement of young men. Okay, and that this is sort of what was driving the Sinn Féin victory, when of course more women are enfranchised in 1918 than men, and as we'll see later on, women are older by design in terms of the ability to vote. As I said, we have little evidence for men. We do also, when we look at turnout, find a negative relationship between voting and women voters. So where there was more women voters as a share of the electorate, we find that turnout rates were lower, or non-voting was higher, whichever way you want to put that. So this is the sort of roadmap for the talk. I'm just going to give some brief motivation and background before we get to the actual empirical stuff that the data collection and the trying to get an empirical picture of Ireland at the time of the election. So probably don't need to motivate this piece of research to this audience. When I present this elsewhere, of course, I have to justify the fact that I'm doing history. It's a real pleasure to not have to do that. But what I think is still important is the fact that the 1918 election is somewhat overshadowed by other events that occurred in and around the same time. Of course, we are living through the decade of centenaries. We are celebrating or commemorating all of these events. But this is taken from the Decade of Centenaries website, the Irish government website, the official one. And the 1918 election is missing from this list. It falls somewhere, obviously, between the Easter Rising and the formation of the First Dáil. It is how the First Dáil comes about is due to this 1918 election. But in our opinion, this sort of, when myself and Alan and Enda were talking about this, it seemed to get marginalised somewhat in terms of the coverage of this period. It's not to say people haven't discussed it, but relative to other events, it is less well covered. So this brought me to trying to think about what are the aspects of this decade of centenaries, of this period, that we remember more than others or that we focus on more than others. And so I decided I'd have a look at Google Ngrams. Okay? This is a site that's run by Google. Basically, they've taken a sample of millions of books that they've digitized from libraries across the world. And you can search for phrases or words in this and show their frequency. So it gives you a sort of a rough approximation, perhaps, of what people are publishing, what they're writing, and what they're publishing at a certain time. So I thought I'd sort of plug in a few phrases from Irish history. Perhaps you cannot see this very well, but really what I think is happening over the course of the 20th century is the emergence of the Easter Rising as being the thing that people talk about above all else relative to other events of this period. So the other things we know about this period from our school history, the Civil War, the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant, the First Dáil, the Curragh Mutiny, all of the conscription crisis, all of these things land down somewhere near the bottom. And what we can see when we look at the Easter Rising is this has not always been so far ahead in terms of how frequently it's mentioned. And of course, this is just the Easter Rising. We also have the 1916 Rising, because you have to be specific with the words you put in. And this shows that this has been increasing over time. The famine, of course, is being up there as one of the leading sort of points of discussion in the 20th century. But I was trying to find some sort of mention at the 1918 election, trying to put this in context with the other things that people talk about in this period. And I tried every combination I could to try and boost the 1918 elections, sort of to pick up any mention of this election. So this is all of the times the 1918 election appears in publications in Britain and Ireland, plus any of these other phrases. Now this, of course, covers not just the election in Ireland. Okay, this is the 1918 election as mentioned anywhere. Okay, it was a big election in Britain, of course, the Carkey election, the franchise had been extended there. But really, people don't pay much attention to this relative to other aspects of Irish history from this part. The other thing that's particularly interesting here is the commemorations, the spikes you see in commemorations. So it does seem that commemorations are important, and they seem to have, for the Rising anyway, it's the late 1960s, and we're assuming it's something to do with the 50th anniversary, but it doesn't just spike up and fall back down. It seems to permanently sort of elevate the 1916 Rising above every other aspect of this period. So that was sort of our sort of thoughts on where we can relocate the 1918 election and see if it can get a little bit more, we could say something more on this. So really why we think this is important, why we want to focus on the 1918 election is this is really when Irish nationalism went from a parliamentarian approach to a radical Republican form. This is when, between 1916 and 1918, something quite remarkable happened in Ireland, in that this complete change of heart in Ireland took place, and that allowed a dominant party like the Irish Parliamentary Party to be completely overturned in 1918. A relatively obscure party only a few years before manages to sweep the seats in the south of Ireland anyway. Okay, so this was something that we thought was particularly important, but wanted to say something more on. Perhaps then we could also learn something more about voting rights being extended in general. Can we learn any lessons from 1918 about the effect of large scale voting changes? Does it necessarily mean electoral or franchise extensions mean big changes? And we think that this is useful to look at too. So I won't spend too long on the background, the story that you need to know to understand the context of this research. This cover always amuses me, because the only woman they could find to put on the cover before Mary Robinson was Molly Malone. But of course, the backdrop to the 1918 election, we have the Irish Parliamentary Party being the dominant force of Irish nationalism in the late 19th century. Of course, Home Rule is its ultimate goal, but it manages to achieve a number of important breakthroughs in terms of land reform and the Labourers' Acts and other things that have profoundly changed Irish life. They fail to bring Home Rule into effect. They ultimately win the 1910 election in December, and they have 73 seats. 73 numbers is quite interesting, as we'll see going forward. So, the previous elections in 1918, the Irish Parliamentary Party is all dominant. They managed to exploit the balance of power in Westminster to get a Home Rule bill passed, and because of the Parliament Act, this will become law in 1914. And so, on the eve of the First World War, despite the fact that we have the opposition to Home Rule from the Ulster Volunteers and the response of the Irish Volunteers, we have Home Rule on the statute book and ready to be enacted. What changes then, of course, we need to look at 1916 and those crucial years during the First World War, and what happened to Irish nationalism during that period. The origin of Sinn Féin as a party, it has a somewhat strange origin relative to where it will end up. This is from their first Sinn Féin policy. One of the main grievances that the Sinn Féin party originally was trying to redress was this cross of gold, the idea that Ireland was paying too much in tax to Britain, and that this needed to be remedied. This was going to be what was the sort of one of the flagship policies of this movement. Famously not Republican to begin with, it's based on the Austro-Hungarian model of dual monarchy. But what emerges after 1916 is that the party becomes the sort of banner under which all the sort of disparate strands of Irish nationalism, including the more radical ones, start to sort of coalesce. They get linked erroneously to the 1916 Rising. It's dubbed the Sinn Féin Rebellion, and this helps to sort of elevate the party in the public consciousness. The successes in 1917 are seen as a marker of the rise of the party. They win the 4 by-elections in 1917, and at the end of 1917, they managed to reform, basically, under the sort of the presidency of De Valera, and Arthur Griffiths stepped back as a vice president, and they sort of emerge as a potent political force at this stage. Interestingly, the British authorities apparently were happy to let this Ardèche go ahead because they thought that this would be an opportunity for the different sides and different factions within this group to sort of argue and fall out. So the fact that this movement actually manages to hold itself together and emerge as a unified party surprised even the British authorities at that time. It's not all plain sailing for the Sinn Féin party. They managed to lose 3 by-elections in 1918. The Irish Parliamentary Party wins these and gets a sort of a brief boost in terms of morale. But nonetheless, the sort of situation on the run-up to the 1918 election is far from a foregone conclusion. Okay, it's not quite clear yet to anyone that the Irish Parliamentary Party is going to suffer the defeat that it will ultimately suffer. There is obviously some signs that things have changed, but the scale of the losses are not quite fully appreciated. Which brings me to the other important part of this paper and of this research, the Representation of the People Act in 1918. So this has a profound effect on the Irish electorate, almost tripling in size. As I mentioned before, it has 2 parts. It enfranchises about 500,000 men and about 700,000 women in Ireland. So the previous restrictions on male franchise or male suffrage are lifted. These included property requirements and, importantly, the sort of registration restrictions in terms of residency were eased, so that more men over 21 could now vote. And almost all men over 21 are now entitled to vote. Previously it had been based on a household suffrage on a property requirement, which had disenfranchised probably about 40% of men over 21. Of course, women get the vote, but only women over 30, and those that are ratepayers in their own right or are the wives of ratepayers. So there's estimates of how many of the women over 30 actually were entitled to or were able to register to vote. But these restrictions probably eliminated about 20% of the women over 30. So it was a restriction. If you were a housekeeper, if you're a domestic servant over 30, you wouldn't be entitled to vote in this case. But the peculiar nature of the 1918 election was that it wasn't just the new voters who were new voters. The fact that there'd been 8 years since the previous election, the longest in recent or in parliamentary history, I believe, coupled with the fact that so many constituencies had been uncontested previous to 1918, meant that it's estimated, this is Don Coakley's estimation, that about only 20% of the population had actually previously voted. So it was a new electorate, not just because of the extended franchise. So Sinn Féin, this is the electoral map, basically after the 1918 election results. So we have Sinn Féin dominating the south of Ireland, Unionists consolidating their hold on the north, with the Irish Parliamentary Party reduced to just 6 seats. They managed to win the 4 of the constituencies in Ulster, plus the Falls in West Belfast, and the Redmond seat down here in Waterford. Things look a little less clear-cut when you look at vote shares in terms of the actual percentage of the vote that the party gets. Of course, the first-past-the-post system exaggerates the scale of the victory in terms of seats, but nonetheless, the vote shares are convincing enough in some ways. So here we have the sort of the spread of the vote shares, with the dark green ones being the uncontested constituencies. So 25 of the constituencies are uncontested. But the 6 seats only represents, it's only generated from 22%, or almost a quarter of the votes, shows you how much the defeat of the Irish Parliamentary Party is overstated by the election, the seats results. So this is the question we're trying to answer. Why did this happen? How did this landslide victory come about? Well, it could come about because people just changed their mind. The electorate changes because of 1916. There's a radicalization. These are the sort of the usual suspects that are put forward in terms of explaining what happened between 1916 and 1918. The conscription crisis looms large in much of this literature in that it galvanized support for Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin emerges as the party that is sort of at the forefront of the anti-conscription movement. Even though the Irish Parliamentary Party is probably just as forceful in its opposition, it walks out of the House of Commons in opposition to conscription that has been brought in 1918 in Ireland. Now, it hadn't actually been, well, it had been on the statute book and it had been passed, but it hadn't actually been enacted yet. So the successful campaign to resist conscription was credited to Sinn Féin, by and large. People don't just look at the sort of success of Sinn Féin, you've got to look at the failures of the Irish Parliamentary Party. Had they sort of allowed their electoral machine to decline and to deteriorate over the period that they were facing very little opposition in the elections in the early 20th century in particular, and that our organisation was really just not as good as it should have been, and they weren't ready to face an organised party like Sinn Féin in 1918. Others have argued that it was the failure ultimately to get Home Rule enacted that was the final nail in the coffin for the Irish Parliamentary Party, in that they had tried and got as far as parliamentary sort of procedure could, that we'd had to take a different route to Irish self-determination than the parliamentary one. But of course, what also could have happened is that the electorate could have changed and you bring in a whole group of people who have different preferences to the previous electorate. And that's the part we want to focus on. So these are the things that could have happened. We want to see if whether we can eliminate this as a possibility. So at the time, there was an awareness that the franchise changes would have an effect. People were unsure, and people had different views about how this would affect the party system. This is a quote from William Doris, the IPP MP for West Mayo. He says that on the old register we were perfectly safe, and the question is how the extended franchise will affect us. I am satisfied the majority of the women over 30 will be with us, but the vast majority of the boys from 21 to 30 will be against us. They appear to have gone mad and no doubt will have all kinds of intimidation, personation, etc. Okay, so he was quite clear that women would be sympathetic to the Irish Parliamentary Party, and that it was the young men that were seemingly the most vocal or engaged members of the supporters of Sinn Féin. Okay, so this is the sort of isolating the gender difference perhaps in preferences. Now, this voting and the link between suffrage reform and the 1918 election result really originates with Farrell when he argues that the Irish Parliamentary Party would have won had they not had this change. This sort of sparked a lot of interest in this question, and we have many prominent Irish historians taking this question on and by and large challenging this assumption. So Tom Garvin looks at the relationship between youth and the Sinn Féin victory or Sinn Féin results for about 13 counties. Didn't find any relationship. David Fitzpatrick, like great David Fitzpatrick, looked at the sort of the evidence from the by-elections and concluded that if this franchise had been so effective or so important, then how had Sinn Féin managed to win the by-elections in the period under the old register, the period before the Representation of the People Act. So it's not completely or universally accepted, of course, this view. When we look at the 1918 Representation of the People Act, for Britain in general, most of the research that looks at this doesn't find much of an effect from the changes in the voting rights that occurred there. That this did not usher in immediately, anyway, the Labour Party in Britain. It didn't have a profound effect on the political system in Britain. So a couple of things that, when we've talked to people about this, that come up, and when you discuss this, is that, well, it looks like in some places, and this is something that Farrell cites as well, in some places the Irish Parliamentary Party does actually keep its vote as it had in the previous election. Very few sort of points that you can look at, but it certainly does appear that they're able to hold their vote. And this has led people to assume that the old voters in 1910 voted the same way in 1918, and that surely then it's the extension of the franchise that it's what swamps these old voters. But of course, there's many ways to get to this sort of a result. We don't know from this whether this is people switching or which group is voting for which party. So it could be that the share that they behave exactly the same way, or the different groups behave in different ways. The outcome can still be the same. Now, this question as well is another one that comes up all the time. Was this a victory of the young over the old? And in some respects, I'm sure that's correct, as people were observing this in 1918, that it certainly looked like the young were enthusiastically supporting Sinn Féin. But when you apply this to the electorate, it doesn't seem to be as convincing. So what we did, just to look at some sort of descriptive statistics for the old electorate, if you took the average age, this is using the 1911 census, the average age of all household heads over 21 in 1911, you get an average age of 51. So that's sort of to proxy for the average age of a voter under the old register. The new males, who were by and large, or the largest group of these were non-household heads over 21. So this was sort of the biggest part that was disenfranchised. Generally the sons of the household head, who was perhaps not yet formed their own household, but was over 21. The average age, of course, of this group is lower, okay, at 36. And this is the sort of more youthful group that people seem to have focused on. What people seem to have forgotten is the fact that women getting the vote are over 30. So the average age of women over 30 in 1911 was 51. So these different groups have quite different age profiles or average ages. When you put it together and sort of calculate what the average age of the electorate was in 1918, you get a number, an age of 47. So yes, the electorate does get a little bit younger, but not by very much. And that's how we sort of interpret that change. So an average age of 51 in 1910 to perhaps an average age of 47 in 1918. But I think it's the fact that people have ignored or overlooked or not paid enough attention to the enfranchisement of women who were older. So what do we do in terms of our research? How do we go about answering this question? Well, we take the 100 constituencies, these are the constituencies for 1918 minus the university constituencies, and link these to the 1911 census to try and get a picture of each constituency from a demographic perspective. Okay, so what's going on? We have all of the information from the 1911 census at an individual level, digitized by Alan here, and we can use this to then get a good picture of what's going on. Now, it's not perfect to have the 1911 snapshot to match up to 1918. Clearly things have happened in the interim, but it's the closest we can get, and we do some checks to see that it's an appropriate way to sort of characterize a constituency. So this took quite a lot of work, and I want to credit our research assistants who did the work on this, of matching the boundaries. Okay? And anyone who knows Irish history or Irish administrative boundaries knows that this takes some time to do. Okay, so we have the 1911 census data at the DED, the District Electoral Division level, and this had to be sort of fitted around the boundaries for the parliamentary constituencies, so that we could be sure, or to be reasonably confident, that we were comparing the same areas. So to do this, we used the sources in the parliamentary papers, sources on the Boundary Commission and the electoral commissions that were defined the boundaries. So this is obviously a map for Tyrone. We have these little dotted lines are the DEDs, and the darker lines are the electoral constituencies. Now, that may look like it was a relatively straightforward job to do it, and that's an example of one that sort of fitted neatly in. They only defined the DEDs by the Boundary Commission in 1917, 1918. When we look at the constituencies that didn't change, that they left untouched, they didn't use DEDs, they used baronies to define constituencies. So there was quite a bit of matching and overlapping, and we tried to make the best sort of match we could based on the amount of area that was covered. So we think we got a pretty good match for the constituencies, and we're relatively confident based on the checks that we performed that we have a good picture and we haven't done anything completely wrong. So we have our 1911 census data and we have the constituencies. Obviously we need the Sinn Féin votes and the votes for the other parties, which we take from the ARC election archive. Key, of course, is the number of electors, the number of people who are entitled to vote in each constituency. And we managed to, quite early on, come across this information in the parliamentary papers. This is how they appear in the parliamentary papers in 1918, just before the election. This is the breakdown for each constituency. This is, of course, Belfast. For each constituency in Ireland, the number of voters of each kind in each constituency. So for the Cromac division here, we have the men who are entitled to vote in parliamentary elections, the women are entitled to vote, and the totals. And then we have local government electors, the business vote that was still existed in 1918, although it was relatively small, and also the military vote. That was also people were entitled to vote if they were 19 or over, if they were could prove that they were abroad, I think, but would be entitled to vote if they were back in their constituency at home. So this was trying to give a vote to returning British soldiers or those that hadn't quite returned yet. So what this allowed us to do then was to look at the areas where there was more women voters relative to the men, and where there was less, and try and get some variation there across constituencies. In some places there's going to be more women voters, in other places there's going to be fewer. So unfortunately, as you can see from this table, we only have male voters. They don't tell you whether these are newly enfranchised male voters or people who would have qualified under the old register. So we have to do make some assumptions and do some calculations to try and get at a figure for that would represent the new male electorate for each constituency. So what we do is to use the local electorate. Okay, so the local electorate was very similar, in fact, to the old parliamentary franchise. You would have to the qualification was based on household. It was male, although women were also allowed to qualify for vote before 1918 in the local elections. But the continuity was there between the male local electorate and the male parliamentary electorate. So what we do then is to take the difference between the total electorate and the local electorate to give us an estimate of the newly enfranchised electorate, male electorate. As we have the number of total males, we can take away the males entitled to vote in the local elections. So just to be on the safe side, we want to look at the how this might compare to the electorate in 1910. Of course, there's a number of boundary changes in between 1910 and 1918 that complicated our matching of districts. But for the 50 or so constituencies that stayed the same over that period, we were able to, there's about a 90% correlation between our estimate of what the old electorate would have been in 1918 and the actual old electorate in 1910. So we think we've got a pretty good measure of the new voters. Okay, so what do we take from the census? What are we interested in looking at? Well, we want to look at the class structure of each constituency. Clearly, religion is going to be a major factor in this election and determining who you vote for. But we can look at many different things. So we can look at the average age overall, we can look at population density, and we can control for these in our statistical models. So this is just sort of our descriptive statistics, what we collect and what we can include in our analysis. This is looking at this is our voting descriptive. So the share of female voters is around 36% on average for constituency. It varies though between the lowest number of women is 30% and the highest is 44. So there's not a huge amount of variation, but there's probably more there than we thought there would be before we actually started to look at this. The other variables that we've started to incorporate, this is more recent stuff that we've done. We were asked to do a bit more by our referees in terms of explaining what actually did result in or cause the Sinn Féin victory, and instead of just saying, well, it wasn't the franchise, it was, well, you have to tell us what it was. So we started to look at a lot more information to try and get at some things that might be correlated with Sinn Féin voting. So we have things that are of economic importance, the value per acre of each constituency, the ratio of farmers to agricultural labourers, to look at whether there was some sort of important part here played by land tenure, to look at the effect perhaps of the famine. We looked at the population change between 1841 and 1851. The number of Gaelic League branches, and we relied on the Atlas of the Irish Revolution for much of this stuff. You're able to digitise this and link this to our constituency boundaries. We include the number of military voters, where the 1916 deportees came from, the number of suffrage societies, which is going to be important when we look at turnout, and so on. Okay, and other aspects of female literacy and labour force participation. So we have a pretty rough, or we have a pretty comprehensive picture of these constituencies from the 1911 census and other sources. So what we want to do, what we try and do in this paper, is to put all of these things together to try and look at the relationship between Sinn Féin vote share and new voters. This is the correlation we get when we look at the relationship between female voters and support for Sinn Féin. And you can see here that this is clearly a negative correlation. It's relatively strong in areas where there are lots of relatively more female voters, the Sinn Féin vote share is lower. Okay, so this is the sort of first pass just to compare the two to each other. If you look at the relationship between new male voters and the Sinn Féin vote, we get the opposite relationship. So far we're actually seem to be quite closely tied to the William Dorr's quote that I read to you a few slides ago. So it does seem that where there are more women voters, the Sinn Féin support is lower. Perhaps this indicates that there's some relationship, although it's quite a weak correlation, so we don't want to play too much on that. In the regressions, I'm not going to put up a whole load of tables for you here, but what we find and what comes through is this: even when you control for other factors, this female negative relationship remains. The male, or the relationship between new male voters and support for Sinn Féin doesn't seem to hold very much when we look at in our regression models. And we don't have very much evidence for a positive effect of this sort of aspect of the franchise. Now, we're not sort of completely getting rid of this. There does maybe seem to be some sort of positive effect, but it's not very strong. It doesn't come through very strongly in our results. We also find that where there are more women voters, there seems to be more non-voting. So the question remains then, if women were given the vote, did they use it as much as men did? And there's in the literature on women's voting in the interwar period, this does seem to be a relatively common occurrence, that it took some time for women to fully participate in the electoral system, and that initially they may have been less likely to use their votes or exercise the right to vote. The other things that we find to be related to Sinn Féin's support is naturally religion. Okay, it's going to play a big part in determining which party you vote for. It's also obviously correlated with national support. Where there was higher land values, the support for Sinn Féin was lower. Okay, this is something that we find from our models. Also of interest, now whether this is exactly what it's telling us, we can't say, but this is the map of population changes by parish that Alan has collected and put together, and we matched it to our constituency boundaries. This shows the change in population between 1841 and 1851. And this does seem to be related in some way, statistically at least, to support for Sinn Féin in 1918. Now, what exactly the channel is or what might be going on through that, we don't know. But even when we control for other factors, this seems to be playing a role. There's some evidence also that where there are more 1916 deportees, where they came from, the higher the support for Sinn Féin also. In terms of the male franchise, the only time it comes through quite strongly is in relation to the unionist vote share. And it seems to be negatively related to unionist vote share in 1918. That where there were more new male voters, the unionist vote share is lower. Now, we're not sure exactly how to interpret that result. It could be a class aspect of some sort, but we're not really quite sure what's driving that. So as I said, we also looked at turnout. Okay, we looked at other factors then that might be affecting turnout. Can we explain turnout? Where there was more suffrage activity, and this is from the Atlas of the Irish Revolution, mapping the branches of the suffrage society in 1913 and events and activity that took place, does seem to have resulted in higher turnout. Okay, or maybe resulted is the wrong word. It seems to be associated with higher turnout in 1918. Likewise, we also find that where female literacy is higher, voting is higher, and where female labour force participation is higher, voting is also higher. So there's something here about women's involvement perhaps in the economy or in public life in general that may be related to turnout. We tried to sort of think about turnout in 1918 in a very complete sense and not just focus on the political stuff. So we collected information on the incidence of flu in 1918 from the Register General reports, and we mapped them and linked them to our constituency boundaries. We don't find any relationship between the incidence of flu in 1918 and the turnout in the election. So it doesn't seem to have an impact on people coming out to vote. Okay, so I'll just briefly then conclude and tell you what we think we can try and understand from this research. Basically, we don't think that this has had a big effect on Sinn Féin's victory. In fact, women seem to have been less likely to vote for Sinn Féin, or were less likely to have given support to Sinn Féin, and that the male franchise perhaps comes through in some way, but is not very convincing or not very strong a relationship. Why do we not see a bigger impact of the 1918 Representation of the People Act? Well, perhaps it's sort of muted by the lower turnout, particularly among women. But this might have had a bigger effect had more women turned out, but the fact is that they seem to have been turning out in lower numbers. So this points us to looking at the other explanations for the landslide victory in 1918, if it's not the franchise, and that's our conclusion, then it has to be something else. Something quite dramatic must have happened between this period, and we're back to the usual suspects of the conscription crisis and the aftermath of 1916 in explaining the Sinn Féin victory. And this was some change of heart in the electorate. It wasn't just some sort of mathematical effect of the Representation of the People Act that delivered this youthful electorate that would sweep Sinn Féin into power in Ireland. But we also want to think more about these economic factors, and we do think that some of the relationships that we find indicate that there was an economic dimension to voting in 1918. And that's something we're trying to understand and explore further. Okay, so that's me. I'll leave it there. Thank you.